Hi, I'm Phil Ashley from the American Anglican Council with another episode of One Big Idea, where we look at the scriptures for the upcoming week and ask, how does this apply to the church? How does this apply to our lives, our culture? And the lessons for this week are wonderful. I know many of us have been living in Psalm 91, which is a wonderful place of comfort, particularly when you're looking and living in the middle of a plague and a pandemic. But I want to commend to you the words of Jesus from Mark chapter 10, where after a spirited argument among the disciples about who is greatest in the kingdom and what they would do with the positions and power they would exercise, Jesus says, "Look, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So there's one big idea for this Sunday. It's this: if you want to be great in God's kingdom, learn to be the servant of all. That one holy ambition ought to be being a servant as Jesus was. And so these lessons from Mark and from Hebrews 4 and the prophecy in Isaiah 53 of the suffering servant are all about servant leadership, which is characterized by sacrifice over self, by service over power, and by suffering over security. And we see this in Isaiah 53 as well, where it talks about the exchanged life, what the suffering servant, who is the Messiah, and who is completely modeled by Jesus, what he does. His sacrifice is grief, infirmities, and insecurities. Our gain, security, and solid emotions. His sacrifice, sins and transgressions laid upon him. Our gain, forgiveness from guilt. His sacrifice is weaknesses. Our gain is strength and wholeness. That's what the exchange life is in terms of the very foundation for servant leadership and being a servant in following Jesus. But also we read in Hebrews 4 about how he has earned the right to be followed because he's laid down his life for us. The servant leader who earns his right by sympathizing with our weaknesses, tempted in every way as we are, yet did not sin, and sits at the right hand of God interceding for us. And he knows our weaknesses. He gives love and mercy. Isn't that the spirit in which we exercise servant leadership? Well, there's some good examples as we think about how this applies to both the church and the culture. In the church, there is a young man named Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who was sent by his family to visit the capital cities of Europe before he assumed control of the estate in Saxony. And as the story goes, he was staring at a painting of Jesus wearing a crown of thorns with an inscription that read, "All this I did for thee, what doest thou for me?" And there and then, the young count asked the crucified Jesus to draw him into what Paul says in Philippians 3:10, the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. And so Jesus answered his prayer. And in 1722 and 1723, he sent Christian refugees from Bohemia and Moravia to Zinzendorf's estate in Saxony. And together they formed the Bohemian and Moravian Brethren, a group from whom we get some of our greatest and most beloved hymns. Their worship of Jesus the Lamb led them into global mission. And in fact, they were one of the first missionary sending movements because they were servant leaders following in the footsteps of Jesus. And between 1732 and 1736, these missions of the Moravian and Bohemian Brethren were founded in the Caribbean, Lapland, Greenland, North and South America, South Africa, Labrador, Australia, and all the way to the borders of Tibet. It was these Bohemian and Moravian brethren who, in the middle of a terrible storm threatening to sink the ship that John Wesley was on, whose singing of hymns so moved him and convicted him that it became a vital link in the very Wesleyan revival that then took over England. See what happens when we lead, when we serve, when we sacrifice, as Jesus did. It leads to mission. It leads to revival. And what message does this have for our culture? Well, the world loves power, right? But Jesus upends this lust for power, this worldly lust in the life of the disciples, when he says, look, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Could there be a better description of the kind of politics that we experience on all sides today? And then Jesus upends it with 4 words, not so with you. Reminded of a time at the National Prayer Breakfast in 1994 when Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who was such a slight and unimposing figure physically, but who boldly called out abortion as the #1 threat to world peace and stunned the audience in D.C., all these power brokers with this plea, and I quote, "Please don't kill the child. I want the child. Please give me the child. I'm willing to accept any child who would be aborted and to give that child to a married couple who will love the child and be loved by the child." And that little woman towered above every power broker and every power seeker there because she was willing to become the servant of all, the servant of the least, just like Jesus. So that's the message. If you want to be great in the kingdom of God, learn to be the servant of all. It begins in the church and it flows out into the culture, and you may be serving somewhere in that culture. Serve, lead as a servant leader, as Jesus would. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.